We were proud to be living in the Soviet Union. To me, it was complete nonsense, the very idea that someone would want to leave the Soviet Union. There was a contingent of people that even during Soviet times viewed Russians with hostility, like it's these foreign people coming over to our land, repressing us. We came to help them get their economy up and running and their agriculture going. Those people are the shame.
Every screen now only speaks ill of Russia and positively of the West. Even today, anytime anything happens, say a transformer catches fire at a power relay, whose fault is it? Russia's.
In my 22 years living in Ukraine, I never came across of Ukrainian language being repressed.
Even several of our general secretaries. Brezhnev was from the Ukraine, Khrushchev was from the Ukraine.
Comrades, I'm happy to announce I was able to get an interview with people who lived in Soviet Ukraine and have pro-Russian views on the matter. It's a point of view that we, obviously in the Western media, hear very, very rarely, if ever, and I'm very delighted to be able to bring this perspective to you. This is actually the parents of Christina, who showed up in our live stream on Victory Day on May 9th. So if you haven't watched that live stream already, you should definitely check it out. Later on, after that live stream, we went back to her parents' house and to watch the fireworks. They live on the 33rd floor of their building. And we started talking about Ukraine, and turned out this was going to be a great possibility for an interview. They were saying plenty of great stuff about Soviet history and about the current military operation. And I thought, why not say it in front of the camera? So joining me right now is Christina's parents.
Thank you very much for finding the time for this interview. I think this is going to be very interesting to our audience, especially since in the West and Western media, they never show anything related to the Ukrainian people or people who used to live or currently live in Ukraine who actually view Russia in a positive light. So I think this interview will be quite interesting to people from the West. So let's start with your childhood. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? Please tell us a little bit about yourselves.
I was born in the city of Zbaraj, Ternopil region, in what was at the time the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. About 2 years after I was born, we moved to the city of Rovno, the capital of the Rovno region, also in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. I lived there until 1984. And there I met my future husband, Yura, and in 1984 we decided to radically uproot our lives and move from Ukraine to Moscow. Back then, this was considered normal. It was just us moving from one Soviet Socialist Republic to another. It was the same country, so it didn't feel like moving to another country. We had these big hopes, big plans for the future, and to tell you the truth, even our friends doubted us at the time, thinking we were just going for a vacation for 2 weeks or so before returning. But things turned out such that we ended up moving here permanently, where we've been living ever since.
So, at the time, you just considered it a kind of short adventure.
Yes, exactly right. It was a kind of adventure. We just got on the train with none of our friends even waving us goodbye.
I mean, some of them were there to see us off, but it was all one country at the time. So if you had 3 to 4 days off, you just got on a train or a plane, and when you landed, you didn't need a passport, a travel visa, or anything. It was just you crossing crossing the country by train. Sure, the train might take a day to get there, but you get the idea.
Yeah, the travel connections were perfect. You could take a plane from Rovno in western Ukraine directly to Moscow. You could take a plane or a train also from Rovno and end up in Moscow. There were no borders, it was just a road sign, typically occupied by an ibis's nest that you would just drive by without even stopping, indicating that you passed from the Ukraine into Russia.
It was the same thing if our friends or relatives wanted to come visit from Russia. They would just take the train over. I guess I'll talk a little bit about my childhood. I was born in Russia. My parents ended up in the Ukraine, in Rovno, in '67. Rovno had a lot of people working textiles. There were these new textile factories opening up, so they needed more specialists. So at that point, in '67, many specialists moved to Ukraine from Russia. There were multiple reasons why. Better pay, young families with children were provided living accommodations. I remember the time we were living in a share house, a little one-story building, very dank, which we lived in for about 2 years before my parents received a 3-bedroom apartment. My brother, my family has 4 people in it, had a kindergarten he could go to, since there were kindergartens nearby, so no problems there. Then I went to school for 10 years, a Russian school. We had the Ukrainian language and literature as subjects, but this was still a Russian school. My wife, Oля, went to a Ukrainian school.
Yes, I am Ukrainian by nationality. We had about 22 schools in our city, if I remember correctly, and only 2-3 of those schools were Russian. The rest were fully Ukrainian. And all the subjects were taught in Ukrainian. We also had Russian as a subject, and then we had to choose either Spanish or English as a second language. All the stuff we hear now about the Ukrainian language being repressed during Soviet times, I can only speak for what I saw during my 22 years of living in Ukraine. I have never encountered a single case of the Ukrainian language being repressed in any way. Not once. There were tons of literature in the Ukrainian language. I was in the drama club. You see, the drama club of the drama theater of the city of Rovno, and I remember we held a play which was in Ukrainian, not Russian. We had concerts in the city in both Ukrainian and Russian, whichever you liked. All the legal documentation was written in the Russian and Ukrainian languages. All the stuff about the repression of Ukrainian language, the domination of the Russian language, I never experienced any of this. I had friends that could talk to in Ukrainian, no problem.
Interestingly enough, most of those who spoke Russian went to Ukrainian schools.
Yeah, that's true. See, I, as a Ukrainian, never had a problem with any of this stuff. No problem whatsoever. We could speak Russian to our friends if we wanted to. I mean, our Russian friends couldn't speak Ukrainian so well, that is to say, they understood it perfectly, but they couldn't speak it freely. That usually didn't happen. It posed some challenges to them, even though they had to take Ukrainian classes at school.
Хотя в русских школах преподавали украинский язык, это обязательно.
Do you think this was due to them having moved to Ukraine recently, or?
I mean, no, it was the same thing with me. Ukrainian is not my native language, but while I lived there, I couldn't speak it quite so freely, but I could certainly organize my thoughts using it. And when you, say, play football with your friends, sometimes you say certain words without thinking about it, and I would do this with Ukrainian as well. So maybe those boys I went to school with preferred to speak Ukrainian at home, but out here in the yard, everybody preferred Russian. There was none of this, no, speak Russian, or no, you have to speak this way, or any of that. We never had any of that. He speaks Ukrainian, I speak Russian, I answer his questions in Russian, he replies in Ukrainian, I understand him perfectly.
So it's like they are both mother tongues.
Both mother tongues, exactly right. So he asks me a question in Ukrainian, I answer in Russian, and he understands me perfectly. Then he adds something onto the question, still in Ukrainian, no problem whatsoever.
So the relationships between different people were completely normal.
Absolutely no problems. None. Even my parents over at their industrial sector spoke primarily Ukrainian, because there were lots of people from little towns and villages there who all spoke Ukrainian. Whenever we went out to the countryside for vacation, wherever there were little catering establishments that had waiting staff, they would speak to us in Ukrainian, we'd speak Russian, and there was never any sort of problem like, yo, you have to speak Ukrainian here, or any of that. So at that time, communication was truly international. Everybody understood one another perfectly. There were no conflicts whatsoever. It's now, recently, that all this stuff, I mean, I personally haven't encountered this, though the last time I was to Ukraine was back in 2013. I haven't had any problems with this. Say I go out to a store to buy groceries or whatever, and I have to talk to the cashier on the way out, asking for change or whatever, cash or card, typical conversation for a grocery store. The cashier would speak Ukrainian to me, and I'd speak Russian, and there was never any problem.
Yura's mom told me about this one incident that occurred. In the beginning, we talked about the fact that there were no problems in communication between Russians and Ukrainians, but that was our personal perspective. That was the case for us. We never had any trouble, and neither did Yura. But Yura's mom told me about this one time. One fall, they went to the kolkhoz to dig up potatoes. She was the local manager, so this was perfectly normal. She was just helping out the kolkhoz in the collection of the harvest. So she told me there was this lunch break that just ended, and the men weren't in a big hurry to get back to work. So as the manager, she approached them and said in Russian, "Well, we've had our lunch, we had our break, time to get back to work." So they looked at her and then replied in Ukrainian, "Who the hell are you to come here and eat our lard?" This was so rude. She said she was completely shocked at this. This was so out of nowhere, so she just replied with, "I don't eat lard." But the lard wasn't the problem, you understand? Turns out there was a contingent of people that even during Soviet times viewed Russians with hostility, like it's these foreign people coming over to our land repressing us. We came to help them get their economy up and running, get their agriculture going. Where is the repression? She was the manager because she got there thanks to her mind and energy. She didn't pay any bribes or anything. She worked very hard every day for the same government as them. But you see, this attitude was already there.
I mean, these things exist in all countries to a certain extent. There's a certain percentage of people that are just unhappy. We also have a little of this, let's kick out all these Tajiks that come here. The police are all corrupt. They come here and get a passport and they don't do any work. We have these people here too. When the Soviet Union fell, the people that were on this "you come to eat our lard" wavelength were the ones that took power, started getting to the top everywhere. But now it seems, according to the news, all this stuff is happening like, hey, why are you speaking Russian? Why are you diluting Ukrainian with Russian? Why are you using the language of the enemy? You must not love Ukraine, and etc., etc.
I would love to hear your opinion about why you think things changed after the fall of the Soviet Union, and how things got to the events of Euromaidan and what's happening now. As I understand it, and I don't specialize in Ukrainian history, but as I understand it, the people that collaborated with the Nazis during the Great Patriotic War, a lot of them moved to the West after the war ended, to the USA, to Canada. There's a large population of them still, a lot of whom are people that moved there after the Great Patriotic War, or they are the descendants of those people that still live there, but many of them returned to Ukraine after the fall of the Soviet Union. So I wanted to ask how the atmosphere in the country changed from the fall to the modern day.
You know, after the Soviet Union fell, I remember that day very clearly. I remember hearing the news about Ukraine declaring its independence, and I remember how I felt at the time. My heart sank. It wasn't quite sadness that I felt, but you know, I wasn't feeling at all happy about it. I felt pity. It wasn't even time for any Maidans to take place yet, you know. All this happened after the infamous events of the Belovezha Accords. So, you know, I didn't take it too well. Even though, on the other hand, there was a bit of hope that maybe Ukraine will hopefully go its own way, you know. Still, it was a shame. So at first, in practice, one couldn't really feel the difference now that Ukraine was independent. We still talked to each other, made friends, you know. But in Rovno, we lived on Moscow Street. It's not quite the main street, but it was one of the most important ones. So we lived on Moscow Street for our entire lives. Then suddenly one day our friends tell us that this is no longer Moscow Street, but rather Stepan Bandera Street.
Yeah, this was literally a year or two after the Union fell that they started renaming things.
But I have to say, there were no real protests, you know. It was like, well, they renamed some stuff, so what? So there was no kind of public outcry about all this. No, what? How could you rename Moscow Street to Stepan Bandera Street? I mean, I don't know, maybe some people protested privately from their own homes, but there were no meetings, no demonstrations over it. But yeah, they started renaming things in mass. Some friends of mine, like Yura's friend, for example, she lived on Nikolai Kuznetsov Street. He was a famous Soviet soldier. We even had a monument to him in our city. Then they took the monument down. They replaced it with a monument to the fallen of Ukraine. and renamed the street to Knyagиня Olga Street, which is the Grand Princess Olga of Kiev.
Вот, ну, то есть, как бы,
So there started being this tendency of things changing, so at that point we knew where the wind was blowing from.
I think a major point of note here is that Rovno is western Ukraine. In Dnepropetrovsk, or Sumy, or Poltava, things didn't quite go the same way. All the monuments to Lenin stayed up, all the street names stayed the same. It was only after 2014 that the Great De-Leninization, so to speak, began. That's when they took down all the monuments to Lenin, renamed all the streets, and not just ones named after politicians and generals, but even the writers, like Pushkin. You know how here in Moscow we have Hotel Ukraine in the Kiev train station? They're still there, we didn't change anything. I think Russia is wiser for this, the things it values. Yeah, it's possible we made mistakes, but those were our mistakes. At least we didn't just write off all our history. Good on us, on Russia, for not doing that. Meanwhile, they immediately decided to destroy everything related to the SSR, even though some of the monuments weren't even to communists, like Pushkin, for example. He wasn't a communist. They still took down practically all the monuments to him. So it's like they're waging war on everything Russian. I mean, I know that practically speaking there's an SMO going on right now, but they're just taking down everything related to Russia, to Russians, completely rewriting all their history.
Those who supported taking down the monuments and renaming all the streets to Stepan Bandera and all that, did they openly support fascism, or how did they justify it?
Well, no, nobody supported fascism openly, but they made Stepan Bandera into this national hero, saying he fought for independence. Even though, as we all know, during the war he fought on the side of the Germans. He was a collaborator. I guess they don't have any other national heroes, even though many great people came from the Ukraine, even several of our general secretaries. Brezhnev was from the Ukraine, Khrushchev was from the Ukraine. They headed the country, which included Kyrgyzia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, the Caucasus republics, and they headed the country for quite a while. After Stalin, it was Khrushchev, and Brezhnev died in '82, in December, if I'm not mistaken. At the time, I served in Ravaruskaya, 3 kilometers from Poland in western Ukraine, Lvov region. I was the commander of a logistics division. We moved D-30 howitzers around. By the way, if you look at SMO footage, you'll see D-30 howitzers. Those are the kind of weapons that I had hitched to our vehicles. So I remember we got everything together, stopped the machinery, got out the TV, set up the generator, and watched Brezhnev's funeral. This was '82, autumn. It was cold, so yeah. So there you go, all these general secretaries from Ukraine. After that we had people from Russia, like Andropov, Chernenko. So all this stuff about Bandera, I guess this is the hero they picked for themselves. Suddenly all these monuments, street names, especially in the western parts. I think the people were perhaps afraid to speak out. I think the people, especially those in government, decided to suddenly change gears and become these great valuers of Ukraine with all this.
Bandera is our father, Ukraine is our mother.
Yeah, started changing all the street names and all that. And cities also. Dnipropetrovsk is now Dnipro. So, yeah, everything related to Russia is being destroyed. Well, they've got this hero of their own, Bandera, Shukhevich also, so they have no need for any of ours.
What is your opinion on the special military operation and the events taking place since 2014?
Well, as any other person, I don't think positively of the SMO, but it was probably a necessity, provoked action on the part of Russia. I mean, I can't imagine Mexico having Russian military bases in it. I think the Americans would likewise not have allowed that to stand. Same thing with Russia, it's just pursuing its own interests. This territory is our backyard. You can't be here. These are our parts. We must be in control here. Let Ukraine do whatever it wants, be friends with Europe, but not this. Another thing, the most important thing, is that Ukraine is a neighboring country.
Brother nation.
A brother people, exactly. Everything is intertwined. Families. I mean, I told you, I met Olga in the 80s after my military service. Then we moved here. Her parents and her sister stayed there, her other relatives as well. During my time, when my mom lived there, she also brought her sister along, who got married and had a son, my cousin, who, by the way, still lives there. I don't know how he feels about Russia today, but I'd say there's more than a 99.9% chance that it's negative. Let me tell you a story from my life. We were sitting in this cafe. Last time I was in Rovno in 2013, and this meeting was in 2012. So there we were, sitting at this cafe, eating, drinking a little bit of beer. Then suddenly his wife says, "We're under Russia's thumb." Just completely out of nowhere. The conversation had nothing to do with politics up to now. Just typical, how are you, how are things, how's mom type of thing.
Yeah, the conversation had nothing to do with politics, just a regular meeting between family members.
Yeah, it was all, what's new, how's work, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, out comes this question, well, not question, statement, like, we're under Russia's thumb. I was like, well, what do you mean? We have normal, pleasant relations with Russia. And she says, better to be under America. So, yeah, this stuff was already in people's heads by that point.
Yes, this surprised us, of course.
Why do you think so many people think this way in Ukraine?
Well, I think that when the Union fell, a bunch of people came from the West and started working the Ukrainians. Russia gives you nothing. Russians are bad. You're being lied to. The gas they're giving you is poor quality. You know, saying all these negative things about Russia.
NGOs, right?
NGOs, exactly.
Well, they never hid the fact that they spent $5 billion on Ukraine.
Then they started issuing textbooks that popularized the West with negative things about Russia in them, targeted at kids in the first or second grade. Notebooks where there are pictures where Russia is portrayed in a negative light, with American or Western European flags marked as the victors. So there you go. They were doing their thing, and here are the results of this brainwashing. I mean, they tell us we're brainwashed, but nobody brainwashed us. In the same way that we had Hotel Ukraine, we still have it today. They're the ones that have to rename everything, so yeah. We're not the brainwashed ones. Maybe there's some things we don't know, maybe there are some things they're not telling us, but I still see what's really happening. Meanwhile, last time I was in Ukraine to talk to my cousin and his wife, I got hit with the, we're under Russia's thumb. Well, okay.
We remember the horrible footage. Remember, Yura, in 2014 when that great big riot started? We saw footage of our native Rovno while sitting in Moscow, the meeting of the city council. So in walks Sashko Biley and he puts his assault rifle on the table. This is a council made up of respected people of the city, administrators, lawyers. So he puts his rifle down and goes, "Now I'm in charge, and all of you be quiet." I don't think any of those people felt any kind of great love towards him. I even asked my nephew, "What do you think of people like Sashko Biley?" And he told me, "Honestly, this is shameful even to the right sector." That was back when the right sector was just emerging. These people cast shame on us. So even among their own, they weren't popular.
Either way, thanks to mass media, Ukraine today is able to present only one side of the story of their people. They don't have any democracy there today. Every channel that was capable of saying anything positive about Russia was declared undesirable and shut down. Every screen now only speaks ill of Russia and positively of the West. Even Poland. There was that incident where Ukrainian farmers were selling their grain to Europe through Poland, and Polish farmers boycotted them because Ukrainian grain caused prices to drop. It didn't last long, the support for the Ukrainian farmers. I'm sure that this is a sign that all these problems Ukraine has will not be tolerated long by Europe. Right now, Europe's like, "Come, let us take you in," but Ukraine is a large country. It has so much that it would create massive competition for everyone. Take just the farmers, for example. They will create massive competition for the Polish, the German farmers. So I don't think we've seen the last of the problems the West will have with Ukraine. Especially the Poles, because they've always had this friction with the Poles. For centuries past, they've never had this kind of brotherly unity with the Poles. There's always been this friction, this hostility. Meanwhile, they come over, they hug Zelensky, brothers forever.
This is called, who are we uniting against?
Exactly right. We're brothers because we're against Russia together. So yeah, in this we are brothers, but your people are worse, so here are some toilets you can clean. Your people can be our slaves. Last time I was in Ukraine to talk to my cousin and his wife, I got hit with the "we're under Russia's thumb." Well, okay.
You know, there is an excellent quote that goes something like, "Wars are won by history teachers." I really like that quote because it's exactly correct. I remember Yura and I came to visit my sister, and at that time there was a movie that had just come out called Taras Bulba. It starred a very famous Ukrainian actor, Stupka, and it was a great movie. I remember we brought a copy over with us so we could show it to my nephew, my sister's son, and he said he wasn't going to watch it. I was surprised, said, "How come?" And he says, "My parents said I'm not allowed to." I asked why, and he told me, "My parents told me I'm not allowed to watch this movie because it's pro-Russian." Can you imagine? His parents, our relatives, this is how they were raising their kids in this environment where Russia was painted in this negative light. This was very surprising and saddening to me. It felt like we missed something. everything while we were in Moscow, like life was developing differently over there.
Yeah, exactly. Just as the Union fell, things started developing at a very different pace.
Вы знаете, я даже до сих пор жалею, я тогда промолчала.
You know, I'm still ashamed that I kept quiet back then. I remember I had a conversation with Yura about this, that I still blame myself for not having had my objection known, that one evening with my sister and her husband, that I didn't ask them, how come you prohibit your son from watching this movie, calling it pro-Russian?
Почему вы запрещаете вот смотреть, ну, вот этот фильм, считаете его пророссийским? Вот что
What did we do
плохого
to
вам
you to
сделали?
deserve
Мне
this?
хотелось сказать.
This was before the events of 2014 or even 2022, so it was really disturbing to
И
me.
то есть для меня это было как-то, ну, неприятно, скажем так. Вот, ну, то есть я уже понимала, что тут
I
уже
figured that at
работает,
this point it
какая-то
must be some
вот,
other power at
другие
work,
силы,
one
вот,
promoting a
другой
different
взгляд
view
на
of
историю,
history,
вот,
perhaps
может
one
быть,
that we
которого мы
had
раньше
no
не
access
знали,
to,
живя в
having been
Советском
raised in the
Союзе,
Soviet
учась в
Union.
школе. Знаете, вот у каждого своя правда. Понимаете, люди, которые уехали там, допустим, в свое
But you
время,
know,
вот,
I'm not sure how
ну,
to
за
say
границу,
this.
я имею в виду, ну, вот, пусть они даже были вот там антифашистами, да, вот.
Where does
Но,
all this
понимаете,
come from? It doesn't come
как вам
from
сказать,
nowhere.
Вот откуда
Maybe
берется,
their
да, вот,
families had some
ну,
repressed
не
individuals
знаю,
from the
народу
Stalin
с
era.
этому ничего не возникает. Вот,
Maybe
значит,
somebody
может
got
быть, у них
shot.
в семьях были какие-то вот, ну,
There is no way this hatred just showed
да,
up
вот во
out
время
of
там
nowhere.
сталинских вот времен. Да, кого-то расстреляли, понимаете? Это же не может вот ненависть какая-то возникнуть вот просто ниоткуда на ровном месте. Вот.
I mean, no, it's happened here before, someone getting shot, but there's no way this mass of people would... It's more the fact that the TV and the radio slowly wear you down a little bit at a time, and 20 to 30 years later, you have all this in the Ukraine. These are people who think only negative things about Russia. These are people who put up posters of the Crimean Bridge and then take pictures in front of it smiling. Most people of our generation, our peers, they've also taken up this negative position. Yesterday we were playing soccer together and they were our brothers and sisters, and today they see all of Russia negatively. They don't think the same way as we do, even though we learned the same history together, we went to the same school together, watched the same movies together, and were of the same mind. So, how does this happen? What was said to them that a 50-year-old person would just change his mind like that? They have a different history now. Turns out that the Ukraine was actually occupied by the Soviet Union when it chased the Germans back west. So, yeah, it's definitely a slightly, well, not slightly, definitely different point of view of things. There were cases of this happening. My classmate went to the Maidan.
This was Yura's classmate that told us about how they went to the Maidan in Kiev, coming from Rovno all the way to Kiev to support the event and to breathe in this atmosphere of change. And she excitedly told me that she was there and there was this grandpa standing behind her, who was from the Ukrainian National Assembly, Ukrainian People's Self-Defense Unit, and how she had this lovely conversation with him. She's Russian, and she tells me about how she spoke Ukrainian to him and how he was surprised and gave her a little hug, said, "You speak Ukrainian too?" I didn't say anything at the time, but I just thought to myself, had you met this grandpa from Yun during the war, your meeting would have ended in a rather different way.
So the people have changed completely. Completely different. They think in a completely different way from us. They think that everything during the Soviet times was just a lie. I mean, nobody's saying that the West is all bad. Yes, we did look to the West quite a bit. We had supply problems, everybody wanted all these different clothes and different shoes and things. These jeans that you can go out and buy for 1,500 rubles now used to cost half a month's to a month's pay. So you got paid 150 rubles and jeans would cost around 150 rubles as well.
Do you think this affected people's opinions about the West?
Yes, of course, this was a thing that was always present. There were many who were drawn to the West, wanting to get closer to the West. So this is where perestroika came from, and with it people started going to the West more, to buy things, sell things, trade for things. So the people were drawn to the West, definitely, and there's nothing wrong with this. Trading and living together is fine, but acting the way a neighbor, like Ukraine, does towards Russia is not okay. So, all this hopping up and down on Maidan has led to what we have now. I guess they hopped their way into this. As for the SMO, yeah, I guess there's no other way Russia could have responded.
How would you describe the state of the supply of goods in Soviet Ukraine? So jeans and all these Western goods, were they better than what was available in Soviet Ukraine? Because in the West they talk frequently about the deficits that there were.
There were deficits, yes.
And poor quality goods.
Goods were high quality, actually.
High quality. It's another thing that...
There wasn't always enough.
Yes.
Let's be honest, it wasn't the supply was bad, it was that having a greater variety of things to choose from would have been, nice. More variety of sausage, cheese, milk-based products. There was plenty, it wasn't really a problem, we weren't going hungry or anything, but you did have to stand in line for a while. Nowadays you just come in and in 5 minutes you pick up your meat, chicken, sausage, whatever, and you just go off and pay for it. So, yeah, back in the day, you could actually do something with 10 kopeikas. But nowadays, it's just a joke.
I mean, to be honest, I think you could just come up and take it if you really wanted to.
A morning showing at the movies would cost 10 kopeikas. Maybe not a full meal, but you could get a bit of bread and kompot at the canteen for like 2 kopeikas. Everything's changing, yeah. Feels like even the wheat in the fields is not the same as it used to be. Because either they're using something wrong for fertilizer or something else. Something's changed. Seems before the baked goods were tastier. We fondly remember the school canteen that we had. Remember the medaviki, the smetaniki? Oh man. The smetaniki were so good. Last time we had one of those must have been sometime in the 80s. But you did have to stand in line for a while. Nowadays you just come in and in 5 minutes you pick up your meat, chicken, sausage, whatever, and you just go off and pay for it.
What kind of goods did you have to wait in line for?
Well, in the 70s it was mostly things like coffee. What else is there? I mean, we didn't drink liquor or anything, so I don't know about that stuff, but as far as I'm aware, there were no problems on that front. But when we came to Moscow in '84, if I wanted to pick up a beer, it would be something like 20 minutes in line to get one. Even though you'd think beer is not a, high priority product, there was still a line. But in '84 in Moscow, supply was more or less alright. But if you left the city limits, went to the suburbs...
Everybody would just drive to Moscow to pick up groceries.
Yes.
People would take weekends to drive over.
I mean, not for everything. It was mostly for meat products, bread-based products, milk-based products. These were plentiful everywhere. Flour-based products, baked goods, makeup was also available. Russian-made, naturally. Foreign makeup products were highly valued, so imported makeup products were highly sought after by women. As far as clothes go, there was a pretty low variety.
Light industry left a lot to be desired, that's for sure. The supplies to clothes,
Однозначно, это касалось и одежды верхней, и обуви. То есть все старались купить и достать что-то вот импортного
shoes.
производства.
Everybody was looking to pick up something imported because it was pretty, it was high quality, and there was a shortage of these things, so people would overpay for it.
Вот, иногда, чтобы...
Back in the day, this was called speculation. Today it's called market economics. Back then, they were called speculators.
Now it's just business, but back then it was a criminal activity. I remember the proximity of Poland to our borders, our western regions, really helped us out when it came to clothing. I remember people from Rovno driving to Lvov, which was even closer to Poland, because everybody knew where the market was to buy imported clothes. So people, especially young people, would drive there to buy clothes because they wanted to look stylish, jeans especially. They would just drive there to pick up some things. But going abroad back then was something beyond one's wildest dreams.
The politics of the party at the time were such that to go abroad, you had to be vetted. A simple person would never pass. They'd have to check you. Are you a communist? Are you a Komsomol member? Are you reliable? Are you going to leave and then stay there? Are you going to say bad things about us? So it was like that.
Yura's parents were both communists, so I know that Yura's mom managed to see a lot of different countries. She's been to Egypt, Italy, Finland.
My mom worked as the head of the Department of Labor and Payments at a factory. My father was the main production lead at that same factory, so my mom had a good position, good pay. I can't say for certain how much it was, but it must have been a little under 200 rubles, which at that time was very good.
Which is a lot, yeah.
Yes, that was a good salary. The average around the country at the time was like 100, 120.
120, 130, 150, yeah. So she earned something around 180, I think. So she would travel abroad more than once to the GDR, to Poland, Yugoslavia.
For work or vacation?
No, vacation, for tourism.
Yeah, she would go to Italy for 2 weeks, Finland, all that.
You know, whenever our people left the country, they would try to buy as much stuff as possible abroad, because there was an understanding that we didn't have certain things here. Things you couldn't buy even if you wanted to. So people would bring back gifts for friends, family, and children, like jeans and stuff. So Yura's father brought him vinyl discs from Italy with Peter Gabriel's work. Discs like that were quite the rarity. People would copy them and recopy them and redistribute them because you couldn't buy these here.
I remember the Melody firm released these discs that were called Across All Latitudes, Across All Meridians. that would have the most popular 5 to 10 songs on them. Like, you would have 2 songs by the Beatles, 2 more from someone else, another 2 from another one. And so you'd have this compilation from all these different countries. Either way, I have to say that there are a lot of these negative people, but I can't say it was quite so bad. Sure, the politics of the party weren't quite right, that they wouldn't let people get these things. Oh, it's a foreign artist? We have to check him out first. So we'd have one artist from Bulgaria, one from Slovakia, one from America, and that was all we had. But nobody else was allowed. No Eagles, no Pink Floyd. We didn't have any of these. But people still brought them back from abroad, so there was a lot of speculation going on. A typical vinyl would cost 3 rubles at the store, but those bringing back theirs from abroad would sell them for 50, 40 rubles. That's a third of a month's salary, and yet people still bought them, collected the money so they could get their favorite band. I don't see anything bad about people entering into agreements with the Beatles or some such to release vinyls here. Same thing with jeans. Plenty of countries make jeans. The GDR, India, China makes them. We had plenty of our own cotton, like in Tajikistan, for example, so we could have just bought the right textiles and made our own. But no, it's all bourgeois stuff. That won't do.
So the market filled up pretty quickly, yeah. It was pretty instantaneous.
So you'd come to the market and take your pick. Here are some jeans, here are some Levi's, here are some Lee's, here are some Langley's, here are vinyls, some a little cheaper, from India, from China. Take your pick. So the problem was instantly solved, and all the speculation was likewise gone. The main problem during the USSR, I think, was not enough variety in clothing. A bit more food variety also couldn't hurt. I think if these things were done, the people would be happier now. The people would look less towards the West.
What do you think is lacking today that you had in the Soviet Union?
So, despite all the deficits and certain things missing, today all you can think about are the happy times. Feels like people communicated a little differently. You could go out at 2 in the morning after a long stay over at a girlfriend's house, or like Yura and his friends, then just walk home through the city, the park, no problem. People didn't even lock the doors to their apartments, or just left the key under the doormat or in the mailbox. So in terms of everybody knowing one another and getting along, everybody knew everyone else by name and last name. From the first to the 5th floor, there was never any problem. Everyone would know if someone was having a problem or if something was going wrong. And not just your neighbors' neighbors also. So these yard companies that we would have, where every child from the building would get together, there was nobody organizing entertainment for us. We would make our own entertainment. We would go to extracurricular activities together. Our parents didn't even know half the time where we went. Today, parents are like, oh, we have to get you to go to this club or that activity. Back then, this was free. Join the theater club, the workshop. I signed up for every single library in the city. Every library had something for kids to do as well. In terms of a kind of sociability, everything was different. Education was free. You could just ask your teacher to have extra classes with you. It didn't even occur to anyone to ask for money for such a thing. Same thing with universities. If you really wanted to join a university, no problem. No payment necessary. Same with medicine. Good doctors were always thanked personally, naturally, but these thanks were typically of, here's some chocolates for you, that kind.
Or a bottle of cognac.
So in terms of how people talk to one another, the openness, that's what's lacking today.
Either way, I don't regret anything. There may have been deficits, but nobody ever went shoeless or hungry. So the supply was pretty good. I'd have liked for it to be a little better, but it was alright.
Like everywhere else, probably.
Yeah, some countries were better off, some were worse off. The world had plenty left to be desired.
I remember very clearly being proud of living in the Soviet Union. It's such a huge country, 1/6 of the territory of the world. We had 15 republics as well. So all these minor concerns, they were there, yes. They posed some concern, but I remember a friend of my friends once expressed this negative opinion about the Soviet Union, saying, I want to go to the West. I remember my emotional reaction at the time. I looked upon him with such a pity. You poor thing, what are you gonna do over there? To me, this was complete nonsense. The very idea that someone would want to leave the Soviet Union for the West. So there was this pride of our country that we had. Yes, there were a lot of things we didn't know. The history we were taught was taught to us in a specific manner. So despite all these buts, I was still happy and proud to be living in the Soviet Union. I was lucky to have been born there. It was a sincere feeling. You know how they say in the Ukraine that, oh, you're all brainwashed. Well, we were proud to live in the Soviet Union.
My parents, my mom for example, went to capitalist countries as well, not just ones in the socialist camp. Despite that, there was never any negativity, like, we live in this terrible country, they have plenty, we have little, we've got these deficits. We never heard any of that from her. So all of us had a very positive view of our country. My father was the kind of person that would do anything for his country, so anything else was not even an option to him. So to him it was all, in terms of all this stuff they tell us about Stalin, all that matters is that he was a good leader, he won the war. Of course, they didn't talk about the cult of personality at the time, he never bought into it. No, Stalin was a good leader, the television lies about him, he would say.
But despite all that, remember, Yura, you told me that he liked picking up Western radio stations on his radio, like BBC, Voice of America. The people wanted to hear an alternative perspective because we didn't have one here.
He did like listening to Voice of America, yes. We had this thing made in Riga, this is Latvia now, and he picked up Voice of America on like this radio that he got. So even though they try to block out the transmission, I remember hearing it when I was getting ready for school in the morning. He'd listened to Solzhenitsyn at the time.
One day in the life of Ivan Denisovich.
Yeah, so I'd hear this every day, all these radio noises. So maybe he was listening to it to figure out whether maybe they're telling the truth. Either way, he knew about it. He listened to it. Regardless, his opinion of Russia, of the Soviet Union, was very good. He left this life a loyal citizen of the Soviet Union. This new Russia he did not accept. Back then it was better. I don't know how you're going to live from now on, he used to say.
I'm listening to Yura's story here, and my father was the complete opposite. My father was a communist his entire life. He was a Soviet man, he worked hard. But when perestroika began, Yura and I lived in Moscow. We came to visit Rovno, to visit him at his house. And suddenly he tells me, Ukraine has an enemy and it's Russia. This was my father saying this.
Why do you think he changed his mind?
I'd like to note that it was after the Soviet Union fell. That's when they started renaming everything and changing the information being presented. Your father was born in the Soviet Union, the 30s, right? Born in the Soviet Union. He lived his entire life under Soviet rule. What did he know about life before the Union? What did he know about the true enemy of the Russian people? It was after all this that they started pouring this into their heads. Even today, anytime anything happens, say a transformer catches fire at a power relay, whose fault is it? Russia's. So anytime anything happens, it's Russia's fault. It's mostly the young people that are the victims in all this. These are people who have always lived in plenty, buy whatever vinyls, whatever jeans you want. So why would they consider Russia the enemy? Because the mass media told them so. Told them that Russia's the enemy. I'm sure if you went to Lvov and took every single person in the city and asked each one of them, personally, hey, what did Russia ever do to you, specifically? I'm thinking something like 2% of all the people would say they did this or that, or they repressed us here and there. The rest are perfectly normal people that Russia's never done anything to, but in their heads, Russia is the enemy. I mean, I'm not even talking about the SMO. Obviously, since the start of the SMO, it seems God himself told them to hate Russia for how much they believe it. Even though they're the ones that did everything to ensure the SMO would happen. I guess they should have put themselves in Russia's place. I mean, imagine what would happen, what the Americans would do if Russia put bases in Mexico.